Okay. I'm sorry for not being there in Rome, but I had some teaching obligations, and I clearly misinterpreted my power to reshuffle them. Now, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know whether you can see it or not. Can you see it? The PowerPoint presentation, or
I sent out the PowerPoint presentations, and I sent out to everybody your draft, the draft with those 8, 9, 10 points, resuming your proposals, both in Italian and in English.
Okay. On my PowerPoint, you will find a menu about the issues which we will deal with. A part of these issues are methodological issues. I was asked to provide a fitness check. So I would like to requalify that fitness check as a purposive review of the worker involvement directives, because I don't like the word fitness check. I will explain you why. We will also see what provisions the directives hold regarding review procedures and how these procedures should be best conducted. Obviously, as far as the substance is concerned, I made a menu of a number of topics, issues, which are crucial to worker involvement directives, which, in my view, inevitably have to be addressed. Va bene. I now go to the point of the lexical issue. What is a fitness check? Okay. Fitness checks have already been operated by the European Commission regarding all worker involvement directives. Already some years ago, in relation to the transfer of undertaking, collective redundancy, information and general framework directive, and much more recently with regard to the recast directive. Now, these fitness checks have a bad reputation because, as you can see on one of the slides, and I'm referring to the Commission Working Program of 2010, fitness checks operate within the conceptual idea of better regulation. They are actually officially driven by an agenda of trying to remove excessive burdens, excessive red tape, overlaps, and apparently their primary goal is not to see how we can improve legislation, but rather how we can get rid of legislation. Now, this is, of course, a subject which of unease with social partners, but the Commission has tried to appease social partners during the last fitness check on a number of directives, collective redundancy, transfer, the framework directive, to say that the fitness check can also be a stepping stone to improve, to elaborate indeed directives. And then there is another notion which needs to be explained, and that is the notion of an impact assessment. An impact assessment is something of a different nature. It already presupposes that the Commission is positively willing to table a proposal. But when it does so, it is required to assess the impact of that proposal. And that assessment is not solely based upon the societal, social virtues of such a proposal, but should also take into account the impact of the proposal on the competitiveness of the national economies. It should take into consideration the economic impacts and the impact on small and medium enterprises. And this language, once more, suggests a potential conflict, between what you could call social objectives and economic objectives. As if labor law was a potential threat to, to economic development. Now, so also the word impact assessment is a bit contaminated by this discourse on better regulation, which is sometimes perceived as a nice word of deregulation by some people. So a word which is much more nice is the word review. It's more neutral, it's more innocent. It is a kind of an examination to see whether there is a need to revise a directive. And the answer can, of course, be positive, or the answer can be negative. When, of course, the answer is positive, we go to a revision of the directive, that is, a modification. Now, technically, there can be various situations. You can imagine a directive which amends, which modifies an old directive. And then you have, of course, these two pieces of a puzzle which are juxtaposed. You have the old directive, and then you have a directive modifying the older one. And in the long run, this amounts to a kind of a fusion, and that's why there is also a codification procedure, which, of course, will help to integrate, to consolidate all these directives into one text, repealing, obviously, the older text. And then there is something which is in between the middle of a revision and a codification. The recast, mysterious word, which popped up in 2009 when the EWC, a directive of 1994, was being recast. What does a recast procedure mean? It is officially an attempt to adapt the directive on a number of minor points, which actually might not be so minor, but thus preventing the European Parliament to propose amendments to provisions of the directive which are not under revision. So this is a procedure which to some extent restricts the sovereignty of the European Parliament. So what we'd like to do is to wonder, about some proposals to revise a directive, the directives, and this could be seen as a kind of a review procedure. Of course, the conceptual framework of that procedure is not how can we improve competitiveness, this is not my concern, how can we reduce red tape, but is really driven by a concern of human dignity as fleshed out in fundamental rights, in human rights, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the Bill of Rights, which is given to the peoples of Europe and which contains a right to information and consultation. And this will be my only concern, okay? Now, when we say worker involvement, I try to define that. I try to define that on the basis of a provision which you can see somewhere in the Societas Europaea Directive. Okay? And that Societas Europaea Directive defines involvement in a very broad way as any mechanism which allows representatives to exercise a form of influence on, and then, well, on what you could call it, on the governance, okay, of an enterprise. This can be influence on the general policy. This can be influence on the underlying strategy, which is something different than strategic decision. I mean, a strategy will reflect itself in strategic decisions, or even a strategy on restructuring measures, which are always, of course, the result of a bigger, previous, big strategy. Okay, that all is work involvement. In Europe, it is essentially restricted to information and consultation. And I try to list a number of directives which are at the heart of worker involvement, okay, and you can see that this is a body of directives. This is one of the most developed parts of European labor law. It is dealing with specific scenarios of restructuring. It is dealing with, on a more recurring basis, worker involvement with regard to the general economic situation of the enterprise. This takes place at various levels: establishment level, enterprise level, national level, local level, or community scale level, etc., etc. Now, this body is already to some extent well kept. It is a body which has been regularly updated so that it is as consistent as possible. It does not mean that it cannot be improved further. It does not mean that there are still some inconsistencies. Each time a new directive is adopted or an older directive is updated, it is important, of course, that these new good practices, okay, are taken on board in assessing other, still unupdated directives. So there is a continuous process of updating. What is lacking, and I'm not saying it's necessary to have it at all, but what is lacking is a kind of codification where you would actually integrate all these directives into one big worker involvement directive. I'm not pleading for that, but I'm just observing that that is not there, does not exist either in other fields, like, for example, non-discrimination, where we have a juxtaposition of various directives. Now, I would like to mention that, in fact, a lot of these directives already provide clauses about review. These clauses of review do not imply an obligation for the European Commission to table a proposal to revise a directive. They, in a way, oblige the Commission to assess whether a revision is necessary or not. And can see such a clauses in the EWC directive, in the recast directive, and there's always a deadline which is being put forward and which in the past has never been respected, as you can imagine. This even happens at EU level. And we also have this kind of provisions in other directives, transfer of undertaking, or the worker involvement directive. Now, review of a directive, and especially the revision, once you say, okay, we need to revise, is a legislative process which sometimes is being adopted within the framework of the social policy title, because the legal basis of the directive, the recast directive, the worker involvement directive, is a provision in the social policy title. But there are other directives which have been adopted on the basis of another title, which is not the social policy title, and this makes a difference, unfortunately, in relation to the unanimity requirement or the qualified majority requirement. This is due to the fact that some of these directives predate the development of social policy competencies. The question could be tabled whether transfer of undertaking directives, collective redundancy directives, should now not be revised under provisions of the social policy title, which would guarantee consultation of both social partners at EU level and an ability for them, in fact, to negotiate on the subject, asking eventually, if everything goes well, the Commission by a joint request to implement an agreement. This is still something which is unclear in my view. Now, I would like just to, before I dig after the break into the more substantive topical issues which need to be addressed, I would like to address some considerations, reflections on the way in which review procedure should be done from a methodological point of view. I think it is always interesting, for example, and I was not able to do that, of course, in the meantime, to examine the way in which these directives have been implemented in, let's say, 28 member states, because these member states might have come up with interesting practices, perhaps going beyond the minimum, or practices which clarify provisions in the directive which are unclear. It is worthwhile, in my view, to take on board the case law of the Court of Justice. A review should be an occasion to codify case law, and not just of the Court of Justice, but also, if possible, to integrating case law, good solutions, which have been worked out at national level. A way to operate a review and a revision, indeed, is to look at recitals. Some recitals contain nice thoughts, which are sometimes better integrated into the body of the directive, into the provisions of the directive. Sometimes there was a lack of political will. Please.